Good afternoon, class. This is Mr. Moore, and I'm here to talk to you today about history. So a little bit about what history is. What do you guys think history is? I'll give you a second to think about it. Okay, so if you maybe came up with words that sound something like maybe facts or events or people or places or things or stuff that happened in the past or stuff old white men did in the past, especially that one. Think, is there something missing? Because there might be. And I would argue that that something is interpretation. So there needs to be something, so you have data, and there needs to be something that goes on top of the data that's interpretation. And that is really where you can argue things within the realm of history. Because data itself isn't just enough. It's not enough to say, oh, this crop yielded this much this year, or the Nile flooded this much this year. You have to say, the Nile flooded this much this year. As a result, it caused this problem. As a result, it caused that problem. And this is what the people thought about it, and here you go. That's history, not just the Nile flooded not as much as it needed to, or too much. Okay, so also ask yourselves the question, what is the object of inquiry as far as truth? Is truth the objective of history? Because that's very much common high school interpretation that you might think, but that's also a product of the fact that you're doing a lot of work out of a textbook. But we're going to get into this whole realm of objectivity and perspective. So your two new words here, perspective and objectivity. And I want you to think about those two going forward. So objectivity, of course, is a question like, is this newspaper source objective? In other words, do they have a vested interest in telling me something that's totally wrong or not? And if they don't, then it's probably objective. Well, you can never be 100% objective because you're always a product of your perspective. Remember that. Every single person that talks about anything at any time ever has a perspective. And so they're going to give you their account, and that account is going to be true to them probably, but it's not going to be true to everyone else. If you think about someone like Donald Trump, our president, he's going to appropriate for himself the means to speak for certain marginalized groups like illegal immigrants, or, well, let's just go with that one. So he's going to give you a perspective of what it's like to be an illegal immigrant in the United States. But he's not an illegal immigrant, so it's very hard for him to talk about that kind of a subject from anything but the perspective of, this is a problem that's draining resources from this part of our GDP, let's say. Anything beyond that, and that's really beyond his scope. So you always want to keep in mind, what is someone's scope? What is their perspective? What is their role that they have to play here? And this brings us into evidence. So like, if you've ever watched a court trial proceedings or a lot of TV shows that involve cops, so maybe Law and Order or the second season of Broadchurch or something where you have witnesses and they're called to the stand in court, or even what was that one with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise, A Few Good Men, the one about the Marines. Those, when you call witnesses, or even The Lincoln Lawyer, there's another good movie, but if you call witnesses to testify, are modern eyewitnesses, well, are any eyewitnesses ever, are they 100% able to be relied upon? Is it the case that whenever they say something, that was the absolute reality, and a trial in court would take 3 minutes and then it's done? No, you have to call a ton of witnesses. Why do you have to call a ton of witnesses? Well, probably because you can't trust the first one that came up and spoke. And some of them will lie, and some of them will conceal things, but the bigger problem is that they're tremendously unreliable. Not because that some of them lie or because some of them conceal information or hide things or whatever. You know, I swear an oath to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, blah, 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 as if you're actually going to get absolute truth from them. Anyway, modern eyewitnesses, they don't really know what their own prejudices and perspectives are a lot of the time. So what you'll end up with is people who, and some of your parents might do this, you might do this, your siblings might do this, I bet, where you experience something that happens and then you have to tell someone about it. And maybe you were there or you were related to the event, but what happens is over time you forget things, little details, and then you start filling in the details with stuff that you think might have been true or you want to be true. The scholarly way to put this is it's congruent with your own worldview. Now in court, what ends up happening all the time, someone sees an event. Someone, the same person, forgets some of the details of the event, and they start filling them in their head. And as they fill them in with stuff that is congruent with their own worldview, congruent with their own perspective. Okay, and then they tell themselves the same, story over and over and over and over again until they really truly believe that that is exactly what they saw. The result is that some marginalized person ends up in jail many times. But regardless, that's what led to that kind of a problem, is how they look at something and it's all a matter of what is true in their own worldview. Now, switching gears. This is like part 2 of this video. I want to talk about social history and vulgar Marxism. Now, some of you might have heard of Marxism before. You should have, especially if you took Miss Lance's class. Vulgar Marxism is basically just an economic interpretation of history. The line in Marx that Marx writes is, all history is class struggle. That is like one of the first sentences, if not the first sentence of his book, called the Communist Manifesto. But remember, this is Marxism. Okay, this is not communism, this is Marxism. Vulgar Marxism basically is using an economic interpretation to explain everything that happened in the entire world. It's a tool. Okay, this isn't, no one's arguing that this is the only way to describe all of history, but this is a tool that people use sometimes to try to understand certain trends and changes in history better. And I want to talk about the limitations. So, where are the limitations? I want you to think of that for a second. Okay. I counted to 10 in my head. You should be done thinking. So, the first thing I want to talk about is someone like very, very, very famous, like Mussolini, let's say. Did Mussolini, by the force of his own will, did he change history? Or was Mussolini just simply the product of a growing trend and shift of economic inequality towards a society in Italy that really just wanted economic equality in many spheres and was very much yearning for a fascist regime? In other words, did it come from the people, or did Mussolini tell the people what they wanted? Was Mussolini Steve Jobs, who tells people that they want Apple products, and because he's such a genius, people realize all of a sudden that once they start using an iPhone, that that's what they wanted their entire lives? Or does it come from the bottom up? So which one is it? I think it's safe to assume that in almost every circumstance it's a mix of both. And that you really can't have, in many cases, one without the other. One interpretation, I'll name it, called big man history. That's usually your high school history, where it's like, you know, Hitler decided that he was going to do this, and so he molded everyone's will to be just like him and controlled them entirely. Or was there a Nazi party growing that shared Hitler's views on all these things about world domination and elected Hitler into power because they knew that this was what they wanted, and Hitler would never have gotten elected if all these people didn't want him elected? So, or did Hitler just basically deceive them all, or some combination of the two? Again, I think it's safe to assume that it was some combination of the two of those things. Yes, he was elected chancellor. No, he did not share his entire diary with the people that were electing him chancellor when he was elected chancellor. So, that's one really basic way to put it. But think about this. Is Trump causing changes in the American people? Or is Trump simply a reflection of a growing sentiment within the American people that wants someone who is not politically correct, that wants someone who is going to be arrogant, who is going to be rude, who is going to be, well, appearing to be powerful? Is he simply a reflection of what people want, or is he telling people what he wants them to want? Think about that. Now, we're going to switch gears here. That was big. We just finished big man. This slide right here is big man versus trends and forces theories of history in a nutshell. And this one is talking about things that you're reading in this fourth quarter, and things that you compared to things that you read before. So this is like a little blitz right here in the video. Now, think about the text that you're reading in terms of what are elite Greeks and Romans interested in. So if you go through the list, a lot of these are almost the same. They're very, very similar. So number one, sport. Everybody that we're reading is interested in sport. Number two, religion. The people that we're reading have a lot of concern with religion, much more than we do in the United States today. If you were against the religion in Rome, you were at best probably viewed with suspicion as to why you would ever go against the religion, and at worst, you were marginalized because you were Christian, basically. And the emperor needed a scapegoat for something. No, but actually. Anyway, warfare. They're all pretty much interested in warfare. Remember, on the right side we have Romans, and on the left side we have Greeks. So warfare and pax. Remember what peace really is for the Romans. For the Greeks, it's not quite that extreme. Number four, we have men, obviously, because the people who are writing are men, so they're interested in the experience of men in their particular culture. Number five, sexuality. Sexuality doesn't pop up every time, but it underlies pretty much every single thing that they write about. It's kind of tied up with number four. What are men doing that has a little bit to do with sexuality? So remember, like Romans, you want to be a weir and you want to avoid being a canitus. The Greeks are also going to have their own view of sexuality, which is not going to be the same thing as that. But they are going to make sure you know what their view of sexuality is and what being a man really means. And number 6, luxuria or beauty. So in Rome, this is luxuria, this is pretty straightforward, but the Greeks are very, very concerned with beauty, and the only times the Romans we ever saw were very concerned with beauty were when we were looking at the busts, and it was almost like anti-beauty, because beauty to the Romans, remember, was having all these old people marks on your face and being trustworthy and all that. So I don't want to say that that's beauty, because again, that was trust that they were trying to portray. Where the Greeks are going to be like, we don't want to be old, we want to be young and beautiful and strong, and typically that's why, well, I don't want to say that's why, but that's tied up with why we see a lot of nude Greek sculptures, and that's called heroic nudity. People trying to be like the heroes, trying to be like Achilles in those statues. So now we're moving back into that first bit where we're talking about fact and interpretation. And the way that good is, so this is like part 3 or part 4 of the video. History needs an interplay between fact and interpretation. An interpretation should answer questions that arise from the evidence. History should never select evidence or facts to fit a conclusion that you've already decided on. Okay? When you write a paper, your thesis should not be written before you start doing your research. You should write a hypothesis, you should write a question, a research question, those are great. But you should never write a paper, ever, with a thesis already in mind. I tried to do this once and it blew up in my face so bad I had to rewrite an entire paper in one night. And it was not fun. It was a research paper, it was like 10 pages. It was awful. And I didn't do that well on it because my thesis was terrible, because I had to change my thesis to make it fit my findings, and it was just bad. I basically did research for 2 weeks and found nothing. Anyway, so I learned that early on freshman year of college, but I want you guys to try to keep this in mind before you enter college. Now, remember, teachers do present the conclusions before we present the facts, but keep in mind, hopefully we've already done all the research, so we can tell you what we've found without having to take you through every step of the research, because we've already done that anyway. But, you know, sometimes even teachers, especially teachers sometimes, will be guilty of giving you an interpretation and casually forgetting what evidence led them to that interpretation, or not making sure that they actually consulted all the possible evidence. I myself, for most of these things that I'm telling you, have not consulted all the evidence for them, but I trust someone who did consult all the evidence for them, someone who's probably forgotten more about Greek sport than I know about Greek sport. Anyway. Papyrology. I'll save this for a new video. We'll end this video right there.